There's no boundary between reality and fantasy, because fantasy is simply what reality hasn't dared to confess yet. Anyone who's never heard of Julio Cortázar is at serious risk of missing one of the sharpest, most rebellious, and deeply human voices of the 20th century. Cortázar wasn't just a part of the so-called Latin American boom. He was someone who shook the very foundation of what we call reality. In a world obsessed with normality, he answered with irony, doubt, and absurdity, not to distract, but to wake people up. His story begins in anything but peaceful times. Julio was born on August 26, 1914, in Brussels, right in the middle of World War I. His mother, lying in a hospital bed, could hear the explosions of German artillery as he came into the world. That sound of war became a distant echo that followed him for life, shaping a pacifist spirit that would never leave him. His parents were Argentine, temporarily in Europe for his father's work as an economic official. But Cortázar always made one thing clear: his father wasn't a diplomat, as many believed. And in truth, he disappeared from Julio's life far too soon to be called anything at all. He was only 6 when his father abandoned the family, leaving his mother and 2 young children behind, with no financial support, in an Argentina still deeply patriarchal. That abandonment was a turning point, a quiet fracture in his sense of trust toward the world. And from that wound began the need to rebuild everything in his own way. His childhood unfolded in the suburbs of Buenos Aires in Banfield, in a house with a big garden. That's where the first outlines of the Cortázar universe began to take shape. A world made of dreams, fears, made-up words, and solitude. Because of his fragile health, he spent hours confined to bed, locked in his room. He read constantly. By the age of 9, he had already devoured Victor Hugo, Jules Verne, and even the dictionary. He had written a short novel and composed sonnets for his schoolmates. But when his mother, influenced by a relative, asked him if he had really written those texts himself, something inside him shattered. The doubt, coming from the person he trusted most, hit him like a slap in the face. Years later, he would call it the early discovery of death, an event that, even decades later, would still make his voice tremble with emotion. That pain, once turned into language, became style, because deep down, as he liked to say, the pain we don't understand as children is what makes us writers as adults. After earning his teaching degree and later a certification in literature, he began teaching in various small towns across Argentina. But life, quietly and insistently, was pushing him elsewhere. He kept writing, reading, observing. He had tried enrolling at university, but money was tight. Living with his mother, he had to help support the household. So he started teaching literature, history, grammar, even civics. A one-man band who would soon walk away from it all to look for something deeper. In 1951, openly opposing the Peronist regime, he left Argentina and moved to Paris, where he lived until his death on February 12, 1984. In Paris, he translated for UNESCO and kept writing. But most of all, he observed, Cortázar was one of those rare beings who could look at a coffee cup or an ant and find in it the meaning of time, memory, or life itself. For him, every detail was already a universe. He loved jazz. Louis Armstrong was one of his idols, and used to say that every page he wrote had to have swing. Not poetic rhythm, but something raw and alive, like the irregular beat of a jam session. And if that swing wasn't there, he'd start over. His breakthrough came with Bestiary in 1951, but it was Hopscotch that launched him as a central figure of the Latin American literary boom. A novel impossible to summarize, written to be read in order, or out of order, jumping from chapter to chapter, following the author's instructions, or inventing one's own path. A book labyrinth a game novel, but also a declaration of poetic intent. In Hopscotch, literature is no longer just a story. It's an experience, as if Cortazar were saying, if life is messy, fragmented, and absurd, why pretend otherwise? But it wasn't all just a game. In Cortazar lived both the wide-eyed child and the politically engaged adult. A supporter of the Cuban Revolution, close to the Sandinista cause, and an active defender of human rights, he always felt the need to be present in the world, even when the world seemed unbearable. I never considered myself an exile. I left because I wanted to. But now, yes. Now I realize exile is real and it's terrifying. Words that reveal not just a geographic condition, but a much deeper sense of alienation. Cortazar was Argentine, French, Latin American, but also profoundly stateless. He belonged to the place he wrote from, wherever that happened to be. His entire vision revolved around two central forces, the fantastic and solitude. But not fantasy as escapism, nor solitude as isolation. For him, the fantastic was the hidden reflection of reality, a way to see what reason tries to erase. He told stories where something inexplicable would quietly slip into everyday life. A house that starts shrinking, a sister who disappears, a character who rebels against the author. There was no need for monsters or magic. A single misplaced detail was enough to open a crack in the illusion of normality. The fantastic breaks in when we stop believing everything has an explanation. And within that crack, truth would begin to take shape. Solitude, on the other hand, was deeply ingrained in who he was. He lived it as both attraction and burden. In public, he was charming, sociable, generous. In private, he sought silence. I'm a loner who craves friends, but I can live months without seeing anyone, he once said with disarming honesty. He described himself as a man torn by two opposing forces. One wanted to connect, the other wanted to vanish. Often, in the middle of an evening surrounded by friends, a voice inside would whisper, "Wouldn't it be better to be home, listening to a record?" His characters moved along that same fault line, suspended, confused, at war with something they couldn't name. In The Pursuer, inspired by saxophonist Charlie Parker, the main character experiences existential agony disguised as musical genius. In House Taken Over, a dream turned into fiction, an invisible threat slowly pushes two siblings out of their home, room by room, until they're forced to leave it completely. Cortazar called it an unintentional allegory, but it became a powerful metaphor for fear, loss, and the feeling of estrangement. In Me Caigo y Me Levanto, I Fall and I Rise, Cortazar offers one of his most radical ideas. The recaída, the relapse, is the natural state of being human. We fall, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually, existentially. Our condition is the relapse and the disalteration, he writes. In other words, every act of healing is already a transformation. No one ever rises the same. We are always reborn a little crooked, imperfect, but new. And maybe that's the only redemption we ever get. In his poetics, form and substance were inseparable. Language itself was the battlefield. He wasn't after academic perfection. He actively resisted it. He fought against the official, overly polished, too serious kind of writing. He preferred stumbles, rough edges, and the rhythm of spoken words. He believed every writer had to find their own rhythm, just like in jazz. If there's no swing in a page, that page needs to be rewritten. That's why so many of his stories move like music, flowing, shifting, pulling the reader in while keeping them just slightly off balance. But perhaps the most fascinating thing about him was his ability to see from the other side. As he once said, quoting Garcia Lorca, "I am nothing, just a wounded pulse circling around things from the other side. That sideways gaze, that constant push to go beyond the surface, that's what makes his work feel so alive. He didn't explain reality. He dismantled it, diffused it, flipped it upside down. He revealed that behind every sense of normality hides a mystery, and that every form of order is just a well-built trap. That's why reading Cortazar still means learning to live with doubt, with vertigo, with the unexpected. He wasn't just a writer. He became an ally for those who feel they don't belong, a companion for those who ask uncomfortable questions, an older brother for anyone who still believes literature can tear apart rules, routines, and invisible cages. In an age obsessed with simplifying everything, Cortazar is still a call to complicate, to look behind appearances, to never trust reality when it shows up too neatly packaged. Because, as he once wrote, those who live too much in the real forget that it even exists. Reality, as it's served up daily, is a beautifully wrapped lie. Cortazar tore it open, laughing, bleeding, dreaming. He proved that only those who break, who suffer, can truly see, and those who never fall probably were never alive to begin with. So maybe the fantastic isn't just a literary genre. Maybe it's the only honest way left to talk about what we call life.